I spent the last month working on the 2020 M1 Mac Mini. What did I think? I'm going to share the good, the bad, and everything in between. Hey guys, welcome to Elevated Systems. I'm your host CJ, a lifelong PC user, builder, and enthusiast. However, for the past month, I turned off my workstation PC and did all my day-to-day workflow on this base model M1 Mac Mini, and I shared most of that experience here on the channel. If you missed the previous videos, I put them all together in a playlist you can find in the description below. Because in an attempt to keep this video to a reasonable length, I'm not going to recap everything. Of course, reasonable is relative. I'm sure this will be a long one, but I'll include plenty of chapter markers so you can skip around to points of interest to you. The goal today is to go over some of the stuff I haven't covered yet and to let you know what impressed me about the M1 Mac, what still needs some work, and what about it disappointed me. Ultimately, I'll do my best to take a stab at figuring out who the target user is for this computer and whether I think a PC user like myself thinking about making the switch should. I also have a bit of insight for current Mac users who may be considering switching to the M1 platform but aren't quite sure where this thing fits. So first, let's talk about some of the software and accessories or peripherals I used with the Mac that I haven't gone over yet. Starting with software, and the first application to talk about is Photoshop. Now, I planned on including Photoshop with the After Effects video. I wasn't able to, however, because at first I tried the M1 optimized beta version, but it was complete garbage, missing a bunch of standard features. The most significant for me was Camera Raw, so I couldn't pre-process my raw photos. Now, I am aware that Lightroom has also been optimized, so if you're a photographer, you can use Lightroom to do all your batch processing of raw files and bring them into Photoshop. But nowadays, I only use Photoshop to make, well, YouTube video thumbnails. So rather than install Lightroom for literally like 2 photos, I just installed the non-beta version of Photoshop, and it worked flawlessly as far as I could tell. My raw file opened in Camera Raw, I made all the adjustments and opened it in Photoshop without any issue. I messed around with more system intensive filters than I typically would, and the M1 didn't break a sweat. I'm not sure what was optimized in the beta, but the non-beta actually worked better for me. Another beta version of software I used was Handbrake. I used Handbrake to transcode and compress all my raw H.264 camera footage to H.265 for long-term storage on my NAS. I tested this using both software encoding as well as hardware encoding, and as expected, the M1's onboard HEVC encoder crushed it. Using the 8-core CPU for software encoding, the Mac could only encode at about 8 FPS, but the hardware encoder did it at about 50 FPS. Now, I need to play with the quality settings more, as the values for Video Toolbox encoding on the Mac are not one-to-one the same as NVIDIA encoding on my workstation PC, and the default setting of 42 on the Mac output a significantly lower quality than I get from a setting of 22 on my PC. But once I figure out that setting, I'm betting that the $700 Mac can transcode my footage faster than my $6,000 PC. And averaging about 25 watts from the wall, it does it using about 92% less power. Big win there for the M1 chip. Another program that I used was Audacity. I used this in conjunction with my Sound Blaster K3 Plus DAC and my Samsung Q2U mic. So this is a good point to talk about the peripherals I used with the Mac. First, Audacity worked perfectly, and I was able to record a clean audio voiceover using my dynamic mic. Now, the mic has an XLR connection to the DAC, and then the DAC itself is connected to the Mac via a shielded USB cable. Also connected to the DAC are my PreSonus Era Studio monitors via a shielded stereo RCA cable. Now again, the mic worked fine, however I was getting a steady pattern of interference in my speakers. This steady buzzing noise. Like, every 30 seconds or so. It didn't make any sense. The reason I have an external DAC set away from any source of interference with expensive shielded cables independently routed away from other cables is so I can ensure I have a good, clean audio when I'm editing. Now, I was kinda able to fix this, and I think I know the root cause of the problem, and it goes along with the Bluetooth and Wi-Fi issues many others have been talking about, so I'll get to that in a bit, but I want to finish up with the other peripherals I used with the system. First, I used a few keyboards. They were all Windows keyboards, and they were all either wireless with an RF dongle or wired. I don't have any Bluetooth keyboards or mice because I just don't like them, so I didn't test any on the system. One mouse I did use extensively with the system is this UTechSmart Venus Pro. Now, this is an inexpensive gaming mouse, but I use it for editing. All the multitude of buttons are mapped to resolve keyboard shortcuts or macros. It's like my very cheap, very good speed editor. Now, I mapped all the keys in the driver software on my workstation, and when I plugged it into the Mac, it recognized it as an unrecognized keyboard, but I just closed that dialog box and it worked. All the buttons worked as mapped in Resolve, and I was able to seamlessly use it to edit the few videos I edited on the Mac, which was great because a Mac version of the driver software doesn't seem to exist. As far as Bluetooth, I did use a couple of different Bluetooth headphones to listen to Apple Music while I was working, and it wasn't great. The audio consistently dropped out. The system would periodically lose pairing with the headsets completely, and the range was horrible. Audio would start to drop just from across the room, and this room is only 10 feet by 15 feet. Now, I tried the whole turn off the Wi-Fi thing to get the Bluetooth to behave, and that seemed better, but still not fixed. But I also found that if I turned off the Wi-Fi and didn't have anything plugged into one of the USB-A ports, Bluetooth seemed to work much better. Again, not perfect, but much better. I also discovered that if I turned off Bluetooth and Wi-Fi and didn't have anything else plugged into the other USB-A port, the buzzing in the speakers was a lot less frequent. Now, this was all on Big Sur version 11.1. It's been only a couple days since I've got the Big Sur 11.2 update, but so far, all of that seems a lot better, but not completely fixed. The Bluetooth audio still periodically breaks up, and although it's much more infrequent now, I still get the buzzing in my speakers. So despite software or firmware updates, I think the root of the problem is probably electrical in nature, maybe a problem with the design and configuration of the I/O, which is leading to crosstalk or electrical interference in the main board itself. If that's the case, I don't think software updates are ever going to completely fix the problem. But before I get into more issues, let's talk about the positives. And right off the bat, what Apple was able to do with the M1 SOC as a tech enthusiast is mind-blowing. I've tried out and worked with other ARM or ARM-based systems, whether it was a single board computer or the ARM-based Microsoft Surface Pro or whatever that was, which wasn't great. Whether you consider the M1 a first generation chip or a continuation of their A series processors, the product Apple delivered is outstanding. The flexibility, the efficient use of memory, the ultra low power consumption, the onboard encoders, all awesome. Now, there are caveats to this, but I don't want to take away from the fact that Apple saw a problem with the lack of innovation with their current CPU vendor, Intel, and decided, F it, we'll make our own. I also love the form factor. I built some small form factor PCs on this channel, but this is smaller than any of them and crushes them in performance. And I've seen the guts in here. Apple decided to keep the classic Mac Mini form factor, but a lot of this aluminum shell is empty. I'm actually thinking about designing and 3D printing a custom enclosure for it, but that's a different video. Anyway, another huge selling point for me is the performance per watt. This thing does an amazing amount of work with a minuscule amount of power draw. I had it plugged into my kilowatt the entire time I was using it, and I had all the power saving features like sleep mode turned off. I'll get to why in a bit, but despite that, the typical power draw from the wall was just under 15 watts at idle with the screensaver on. The highest power draw I saw was just over 40 watts while outputting video to ProRes 422. Most other what I would consider high load operations like Handbrake Transcoding averaged around 25 watts. The big deal about that for me is low power usage means virtually no heat output. Let me tell you, running my 800 plus watt heater slash workstation in my little studio in the middle of summer can get uncomfortable. So spoiler alert, I'm not retiring my workstation PC for this Mac Mini, but as Apple continues to refine this platform and can offer performance relative to my workstation at the same TDP relative to this, yeah, I may consider it. So that was the good. Let's move on to the not so good. I already discussed the problems with the whole I/O, and I'll be completely honest. If I wasn't just testing this thing over the past several weeks, and this was my actual main editing system, the inability to use over $300 worth of audio gear with the system would have been a reason to return it again. And the fact that there have been 2 significant system updates and the problem still exists is pretty frustrating. And just to be clear, there's absolutely no difference in the configuration of my DAC and sound system from my PC to the Mac. I literally just unplugged the USB cable from my PC and plugged into the Mac, which is less than a foot away. And even with every other piece of electronic equipment in the room off and unplugged, even my uninterruptible power supply, the buzzing in the speakers was there. I ended up just disconnecting the DAC and using my wired Sennheiser headphones plugged directly into the headphone jack, which worked fine, so that's a big one. There are a couple more, but let's talk about the not so big but still annoying problems I ran into. First, anytime the system timed out and turned off the displays or went to sleep, when I woke the system, the primary HDMI monitor didn't turn back on and the primary monitor defaulted to the Thunderbolt display. Now, more annoying, when I would go into display settings and re-enable the primary monitor, the secondary would revert to default, which for me is upside down because my top monitor is actually inverted. So I then have to go into the settings and flip that monitor orientation again. Also, anytime the system went to sleep, any external drives connected it would be missing on wake. I'd have to unplug and replug them. To fix this, I just set the system to never turn off the display or sleep. And neither of these issues seem to be fixed with the Big Sur 11.2 update, but again, there is some improvement. Now the Mac doesn't wake the main monitor on system wake, it just stays in power save mode, but the secondary display is still the secondary display and correctly oriented. All I have to do is manually turn on the main display. Better, but still not ideal. And external drives still disappear, but now I get the notification it was improperly ejected and it eventually comes back on its own. So needless to say, sleep mode will stay disabled for now. The last little annoying thing I discovered is something I praised the Mac for in my introduction video, and that was the ability to see and access my network attached storage, which now seems to be completely sporadic and random. Sometimes I'll open the network folder in Finder and all my shared and network drives will be there. And then the next time they won't be. All I can see is the network printer. It made the ability to move assets to and from my NAS just too unreliable, and I had to just resort to using an external drive again. Again, this doesn't seem to be fixed with the 11.2 update. Before I move on to bigger limitations, one thing to keep in mind is that of all the software I tested, only Resolve and Handbrake were optimized for the M1, and those were just beta versions. From other reviews I've seen, even the optimized version of Premiere Pro isn't perfect. Now, my cross-section of tested applications was small, but even so, I still found that although Rosetta 2 did a great job of translating and installing Intel-based Mac software, it didn't always function at ideal levels. That's something to keep in mind if you're considering adopting bleeding edge tech like this first generation of a new technology. The applications you use in your workflow may not perform as you hope or expect them to. I can compare it to the first release of NVIDIA RTX. It sounded great until you realized there were only a few games that actually incorporated it, and when you did turn it on, you were like, give me my FPS back. Those were annoying problems that can be fixed with further software updates and optimizations, but now it's time to talk about limitations of the system that can't be fixed. The first being the lack of a dedicated graphics card. Now, the M1 has an integrated 8-core graphics processor, which is a good GPU for a laptop. But this is a desktop computer, not a laptop. And despite the specs on paper where the 2.6 teraflops should theoretically perform close to the GTX 1650 at 3 teraflops, in real-world applications, it just doesn't. It doesn't have the power needed or onboard VRAM needed to compete with a dedicated graphics card. Even the 8-core iGPU in the Ryzen Pro 4700G outperforms the M1 iGPU in the independent testing I've seen. In my testing, I compared the $700 Mac Mini to a $700 PC I built, and like I explained in previous videos, I wasn't going for spec to spec, I was going for price point to price point and attempting to build a balanced system that would be comparable in performance. And despite using only a 4-core 8-thread CPU, the PC consistently outperformed the Mac, and that's because my workflow takes advantage of GPU acceleration, and the dedicated GTX 1660 provided that extra performance. So, quick example, I gave the system pretty good marks in my DaVinci Resolve use, as it performed pretty good in the 2 videos I edited for that particular video. But while one of those projects used a moderate level of color grading, a few simple correction nodes, later, I brought in a project to test the external SSD hub I'm using on the system, and the project had a fairly light noise reduction node on all the A-roll clips. When I hit render, the time remaining started out at over 4.5 hours and was going up. I canceled the render, removed the noise reduction node, and the render took like 16 something minutes. Noise reduction is a heavy GPU effect that I rely on when I'm using the kit lens on my primary camera, but it's just not realistically possible to do on this unless you have a lot of time to wait on your final project output. The second major limitation on the base model M1 Mac Mini is the one I ran into consistently in my testing, and that's the lack of memory. Now, I've already said on a few occasions that the M1's use of available memory and its SSD swap is more efficient than any Windows-based PC, but this computer was consistently relying heavily on the SSD to make up for the lack of physical memory, and the NVRAM used by the SSD is exponentially slower than DRAM. So efficiency is great, but capacity is better, which is why this is surely to be the most controversial statement in this video, but I don't think this M1 Mac Mini should exist. In 2021, no desktop computer with an 8-core CPU should have only 8 gigabytes of RAM. A simple rule of thumb for memory capacity is 2 gigabytes per CPU thread, and that's an older standard. It used to be the ideal standard, now it's bare minimum. The system is way under that, especially considering the iGPU is using that memory also. So I don't think the M1 Mac Mini shouldn't exist, just the 8 gigabyte version. The 16 gigabyte version should be the minimum, and it should be priced at $699, not $899. Now, I know why this one exists. I'm not going down that road. I'll just say that as a capitalist with an IRA, I can appreciate it, but as a tech enthusiast, it's kind of and I'll just leave it at that. It's also good to see that I'm no longer alone in this realization. Many more creators have also come to this conclusion, and many have actually traded in their 8 gig model for the 16 gig model. I'm way past that point, unfortunately, so I'm stuck with it, which is my next point. I'm stuck with it. It is what it is, and it can never be anything more. I can't add an external Thunderbolt GPU because that's not supported, at least not as of now. The DRAM is part of the SoC, so there's no way to add more. The SSD storage is soldered to the motherboard, and there are no more M.2 slots, so external storage is all you have, which is actually fine. External storage is just as cheap. The bottom line is, if you outgrow the computer's capabilities, there's no upgrade path. As a PC user, that's kind of a big deal to me. But let me start to wrap this up and try my best to define the user for this computer, and I'll start with the current Mac users, because despite everything I said, even the whole "this computer shouldn't exist," this is probably one of the best price to performance Macs that Apple has produced. Let's just start with Mac Minis. The Mac Mini has always sucked as far as price to performance. Let's look at the 2018 base model. It came with an i3-8100 with its internal HD 630 graphics, which was $117 CPU at launch. It had 8 gigabytes of SODIMM DDR4 RAM, $40 tops, a 256 gigabyte SSD, another $50 there, had the motherboard, power supply, and aluminum enclosure, and you had a $350 computer that sold for $800 and performed like a $350 computer. That's like a $450 Apple tax. Now, they've gotten better. Let's look at the base model 2020 iMac 5K. Now, that cost $1,800, but it's not an $1,800 computer. It has an i5-10400 CPU, AMD Radeon RX 5300 graphics, 256 gigabyte SSD, and 8 gigabytes of RAM. That's about a $600 computer built into a $1,200 5K Retina display. So it's pretty fairly priced system and probably is the best price to performance Mac out there. But to me, it just seems a little unbalanced. And this is just my take on it, but in my opinion, your display shouldn't cost twice as much as your computer. In steps the M1 Mac Mini. Now, I have no idea what the retail cost of the M1 processor is, but I know the M1 Mac Mini trades blows performance-wise with the $600 computer in the iMac 5K and almost gets to the performance level of the $700 PC I built. So I'd say that for a Mac user, this $700 M1 Mac Mini is a great choice. It technically might be overpriced by about $100, but consider R&D costs on this new tech and marketing costs. $100 Apple taxes, fair in this case. Most importantly, if you're moving up from an older Mac, especially a base model unit, you're very likely to see a significant performance upgrade. Now, if you're a PC user that saw all the hype around these miraculous M1 Macs and you're considering making the switch, should you? Well, this one's a little harder to answer and comes down to your use case and expectations. First off, if you just want to get into the Mac ecosystem or you're just Mac curious, this is the cheapest way to do it. Try it out. If you don't like it, you got 2 weeks to return it. Now, if you don't really care what kind of computer it is, you just need something to do some productivity stuff, maybe work from home, some teleconferencing, then this is too much computer for that. I have $250 and $500 PC build guides on the channel. All the components are available and you can build those yourself and save a lot of cash. Or you can grab a sub $500 pre-built PC or laptop that will handle that workload with ease. Now, if you want to do all that, plus you're looking to get into maybe some content creation, maybe learning Final Cut for video editing or exploring music production with Logic Pro, then this may be the best choice, because if you're looking to build a PC with similar performance to this right now, you're probably out of luck, as finding any graphics card bigger than a GTX 1050 or maybe an RX 570 is almost impossible at a reasonable price. Even the system integrators are running out of components. I tried to configure a PC with just a GTX 1660 on a few of the more popular pre-build sites, and the backlog for the GPU was from 4 to 6 weeks. For an RTX 3060 Ti, it was 6 to 8 weeks. But this, you can buy today. But if you do, keep your expectations realistic. It may perform similar to an $1,800 iMac, but it doesn't perform similar to an $1,800 computer. And in some cases, it may not perform at all. This is essentially brand new technology. There are bugs that need to be worked out. It's not officially supported by hardly any software outside of the Apple ecosystem. The whole "it just works" thing Apple touts doesn't necessarily apply here. But it's a great start, and I'm honestly interested and even a bit excited to see where Apple Silicon is headed. And if you're interested where this Mac Mini is headed, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because I'm not just sticking it back in the box and sticking it on a shelf only to be dragged out for comparison to future generations. Nope, I have a permanent home, use, and user for this computer, as well as a full, complete, and brand new setup to go along with it, which I'll be building out in the final video of this M1 Mac Experience series. But that's it for this one, guys. Thanks for sticking around this long. I know it was a pretty deep dive. Be sure to hit that like button before checking out some of my other videos. I hope to see you in the next one. Until then, stay safe.